Hello and welcome to another week of MIS 776 Business Intelligence. Let me move this over so you can see my face in the screen. So this week I don't have PowerPoints because this is a collection of different notes, lectures, seminars, books, everything else that I've attended over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years. And it's hard to come up with a single unified idea. I was reading a book earlier this year about strategic decision making, and the author had a great point that if you look at everyone's idea on a problem, so you look at a company's or an individual's idea on a strategic decision, a long-term decision, psychologists will come up with a psychological issue of why it did or did not work. Sociologists will come up with a social reason or small group thinking that didn't work. Economists will come up with environmental or economic models why it did not work. And this leads into a problem with a lot of books on strategic decision making and a lot of, I guess, academic books that aren't, 1,000 pages on decision making, is that they're focused on the person's background or person's vision that wrote that book. So that's why it's really hard to kind of come up with any single book. And I mean, I got tons of books on strategic decision making, generalized decision making, corporate decisions, business ethics, and just a million things. And none of them are really encapsulate everything that I want to teach you. So that's why this is just a bunch of notes. So I guess let's get started. So one of the myths, and this is a really big one too, is that here's my is that the chief executive, the CEO, makes all the decisions. Now, someone told me once a while ago that the higher you go up in management, the higher you go up on the corporate ladder. It's not the number of decisions you make, it's the number of right decisions you make. And that's very true. And so often what happens in the corporate world is that you don't see the top making the decisions, you don't see the bottom making the decisions. You see kind of this, I almost think of it as, go back here. I almost think of it as like, what's it? Something like that, where this kind of middle ground makes a lot of the decisions to start with. Then they run it up the corporate ladder. So, here's maybe the COO, CFO, whatever, and then eventually the CEO. Once they get their blessing on it, then it works its way back down to middle management or to maybe upper management, and then down to the people that actually implement it. So it's this kind of nautical sequence that decisions kind of occur in most corporations. Corporations with, let's say, more than 1,000 people, more than 200 people. So a lot of people think that decisions are maybe more like a triangle. You're the CEO up here, and then the lowest worker here, and middle management here. And hey, I say this, and it goes downwards, and that's just not really how decision making actually works. So remember, if you're in here, and a lot of data scientists, data analytics, business intelligence, a lot of I don't want to say nerds, but nerds are in this area. We can push our ideas up, they get approved, and then they come back down to us to kind of refine or to update, and then eventually they get shared with the whole team. So that's kind of, in reality, much more how the decisions are kind of flow through a corporation. Decisions are made in one room. Really, much of the real work occurs offline. Okay, in one-to-one conversations, small groups, not necessarily around conference tables. Let's see if I can switch over to here. So Many people think that, the board of directors gets together and make a decision and that's it. And that's just often not how it is. Maybe for a few big decisions once in a while, hey, if you're buying another company that's worth 90% of the value of your company, yeah, that might be the case. But to get to that point, there was a lot of decisions, a lot of research, a lot of intelligence done before that. So, often a small group, small teams come up with a lot of the decisions or ideas. They push those upwards to maybe to a conference table, maybe to a meeting, maybe to an all hands meeting. And then they kind of get pushed back with, hey, let's make a small few changes. Then once these ideas are kind of solidified, both politically, both economically, both data wise, then they're pushed to all staff. And this generally goes for most corporations and most big decisions. So here's a big one. And I have a video I'm going to show here in a little bit that most decisions are largely intellectual exercises. So you would think that most corporations, most people would make intelligent decisions. I mean, it's just common sense. Businesses are in the business of making money, so they do anything they can to make money, right? I mean, just that's there's an ROI. There is all different types of ideas and all types of lectures and theories we've all been through for the last 10 years about, hey, business's job is to make money, and that's all they really care about is profit. I wish that was the case. Businesses often do things against their own best interest. And not all the time. Those businesses eventually kind of go out of business. But decisions aren't just purely based on intellectual and data-based decisions. Sometimes they are based on emotional factors. Sometimes they're based on political factors. We'll talk about framing a little bit, and a lot of that comes into being when we frame a problem. The decision to that problem, how we attack that problem, how we overcome that problem, has a lot to do with how we actually frame that problem. Okay, so if you watch sometimes TV or I don't know, TikTok or YouTube, well, corporations are only in the business to make money. They're evil, blah blah blah. That's just, if that was the case, the world would be a very different place. Corporations don't always make intelligent decisions. Okay, they make political, emotional decisions, and they try to get data and intellectual biases or proof to kind of back it up. So, the myth is that decisions are basically largely intellectual, and that's just not the case. So, now going on to that one, sorry about some of my text here. So, man, I just got some all types of weird text. Again, because it was on my phone, then went to a PC, then went to a Mac. So, when we're presented as a manager or as a business intelligence expert, we're presented a problem. So here is problem X. Let me switch over to my iPad really quick. Okay, so this is what we're looking at right here. We're presented with a problem. We want to make a decision, and boom. It's just, hey, here's a problem, here's a decision. It's very cut and dry. And that's never how it really is in the real world. Often, decisions unfold in a linear manner. What's that mean? So here's a problem. Okay, so then maybe I talk to coworkers about it. Then maybe I think about it. Then maybe I get more data on the problem. Then I make a decision. Then I change my mind. I get more data. Okay, and then I make a new decision. And then we go forward with that. Now, I, as the decision maker, see all this. And I know everything I did. As a person that's maybe outside the loop, all you often see is problem and decision. Right or wrong, that's all you generally see. So decisions aren't really just a straight, perfect, here's a problem, here's a decision. They just don't work like that. So that's very important to keep in mind. Managers decide then act. Again, we kind of covered that. It's kind of very similar to the last one. You know, a lot of times there's a lot of things, a lot of policies, procedures, changes that take place that prevent managers from acting right away on a problem. If we go back to that Nautilus, you know, here's a problem, managers, whatever. You see, if this is, time, let's say 1 day, this might be 3 weeks. By the time it actually gets to action, it might be 6 months. It really depends on the corporation, the problem, and the time. But things don't always move fast. So I know that we've talked about cognitive bias, but it is a vital part of decision making. So some of this is from Thinking Slow and Fast. Some of this is from a couple other books. I have a list of references at the end if you guys want to look this up. But there's a couple of very important ones I want to discuss. Now, these aren't data-based these aren't data cognitive biases or general life cognitive biases. These are more business and decision-making cognitive bias. One of the first ones is an overconfidence bias. And that's, let me scroll down here one second. So the overconfidence bias is the idea that physicians, it's not only physicians, it's that we're all overly confident in our decisions. And so this hits a couple different ways, this overconfidence bias. The first thing is that corporations, and there's a couple different terms for this, but there's a way that corporations buy another company, and the corporations or the decisions involved in that basically wrap around the idea, hey, we're so good that this company is not as good as us. If we buy them, we can make them as good as us. Okay. Another example of this overconfidence bias is, I am the only person that could do this, or this corporation will not survive without me, or I got this contract because I'm that good. If you would have had Tony or John try to get this contract, he would have failed. And then the opposite of that is when you don't attribute enough negative to other aspects, to external factors. Sorry, my machine has started this weird beep. So we think about this overconfidence bias. And earlier today or the day before, I was just reading that Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's business partner, had passed at 99 years old. Now, Warren Buffett was a very big believer of index funds. An index fund is just a collection of a bunch of stocks. And he felt that it's almost impossible to beat the average. Okay. Now, we think about this, and we're like, hey, you know what? We're in a business college. We're in a top-ranked business college in the United States. We're all very intelligent. We're smart enough to pick stocks better than other people. Financial advisors think the same thing. They think that they're able to pick the stock market better than everyone else. However, that's generally not true. Most financial analysts cannot beat the market over, let's say, a 10-year average. And so that's where the overconfidence bias comes in. It affects us every day in a lot of what we do. So just to have a realization that this overconfidence bias is such a powerful factor that it just affects every business decision, every military decision, everything. And just to kind of drive it home, there's a great video, and this we'll talk about this with a few other things. But let me cue up the video here, and we go to from without video. There we go. I actually get to see me. This is from, what's it, World of War Z. So make sure I have sound here.
In the 30s, Jews refused to believe they could be sent to concentration camps. In 72, we refused to fathom we'd be massacred in the Olympics. In the month before October 1973, we saw Arab troop movements, and we unanimously agreed they didn't pose a threat. Well, a month later, the Arab attack almost drove us into the sea. So we decided to make a change.
Change.
The 10th man.
And see, it's realizing their overconfidence bias. It's realizing this mistake that, hey, we've made mistakes in the past multiple times. We were overconfident. And then they realized that they had an overconfidence issue. And I don't know if this is true or not, to be honest with you. But this is a great illustration of the overconfidence bias that can happen in all different aspects of life.
If 9 of us look at the same information and arrive at the exact same conclusion, it's the duty of the 10th man to disagree. No matter how improbable it may seem, the 10th man has to start dealing with the assumption that the other 9 are wrong.
And you were that 10th man.
Precisely.
So this shows about, I guess he got a letter of communication that there were zombies or something. I can post this. Another thing is called the devil's advocacy, or a dissenting opinion in law. So the overconfidence bias we have to be really aware of when we make decisions. What would that decision be if it was another person's hands? What would happen if somebody else was to run that project? How would somebody else doing that decision affect that person or affect that group? Now, the next cognitive bias that can affect our decision making is called the sunk cost effect. I put a player sports performance here because that's the one I have for my notes from a couple years ago. But the classic example is gaming, casino games and slot machines. So in your mind that you're better at 21 than everyone there at the table, or whatever game you play, poker or slot machines. You know that you're smarter, or that you have a little trick that you can predict when you'll make money at the slot machines or at the casino table. Well, you go in and you promise yourself, I'm only going to lose $200 and I'm going to cut myself off. And if I make $1,000, I'm going to stop. You go in and you lose $200, but since you're down $200, if you just play another $20, you can win. You're that close. Dude, now you're down $250. You're down $300. You're down $300. But I know I can win my money back. And this has been demonstrated in multiple different fields, ideals, and business decisions. Another great example, this is the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is, hey, we were losing a lot of ground. North Korea attacked South Korea. South Korea lost a lot of ground. We came in. We got a good general. Things changed. We went real high up in the north, and the Chinese came in, and we kind of went down. And at some point, we got to this point where it wasn't about winning or losing the war. It was just about not losing. It was simply about, hey, we can't lose. We've invested too much to lose. My notes on this, when I learned about this, was that there's some research about this, and we have a person in this class that does a little bit more sports research than me. But I guess you can take 2 or 3 different sports players. I think it was basketball, if I remember. And you see how much their contract was. Maybe it was baseball players, and say, hey, this player we were paying $1 million a year. This player we're paying, a $250,000 a year, and this other player we're paying $300,000 a year. Okay, so you got their salaries. Well, what happens is that player that you pay $1 million a year, you'll play him more, even if he's not as good as lower players, because a coach unconsciously believes that since we spent so much money on this player, we have to get him out on the field, that he'll make a difference. And the issue is in sports, sometimes you have lower paid players that outperform the higher paid players, but yet they don't see the same level of game time because of their pay. And this affects the winning outcome of sports. So those are 3 examples. Like I said, feel free to Google some of these. I guess I should update my notes here. Again, recency effect and availability bias. Availability bias is is the ability or the idea we place too much information on evidence that's most readily available to us when we're making decisions. Okay, so we think we can make better decisions than other people. We may not have all the information available, so we make a decision on that. And also the recency effect is what's in front of me I remember the most. So if I was to tell you about 5 different wars or 5 different business decisions, so I go, hey, we can talk about Lee Iacocca and Ford. We can talk about Elon Musk and Tesla. We can talk about Sam Altman and OpenAI. Now, if I went through and listed a bunch of these, the very last item I talk about is the one you remember the most. And the problem is that when we're making a decision, even a big decision that can affect millions of dollars, billions of dollars, this plays into that decision a lot. We talked about this a little bit in the past, so I'm not going to go into it too much. Anchoring bias. I don't know why should have really proofread this before I worked on this lecture. I have some other notes, and maybe I should just use those. Anchoring bias is when you walk into Costco and you see those $10,000 TVs and you see $400 TVs behind it. Anchoring bias is when you go to buy a car and there's an MSRP that nobody ever pays. You set an anchor, either high or low, and that can affect so much of our idea of something. It is almost unreal. So that's how some companies do that a lot. There was one of the demos I'm going to do, I think next week, just a real quick, like informal demos on Alltrex. And there's been a lot of SEC investigations whether or not their competitors have been kind of underselling them and talking negatively to kind of drive down their stock prices so they can be part of a corporate takeover. Okay, and so they're using that anchoring bias. Oh, hey, this is not a great company, blah, 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 to kind of drive down stock prices. So when they go to take it over, it's at a cheaper discount. And so the SEC looks into things like this. Okay, now this Daniel Kahneman, he wrote Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. He wrote Noise. He wrote a couple other books. Great. I think he might have won a Nobel Peace Prize or Pulitzer Prize. Very, very great books. So he talks a lot, or his prospect theory changed economic theory a lot, and it affects the way we think about a problem. So I believe the example that he provided was newspaper companies versus the internet. So I don't know if it was him or another researcher that looked at basically how do newspapers deal with new technology. Now there are 2 major ways that we can deal with a problem. So before I go into the newspaper, so we look at, hey, the recent health trends. Everyone wants to be healthier. Okay. So as a junk food manufacturer, I have 2 options. I can see that as a threat. I can try to increase my marketing. I can try to downplay that external threat, or I can try to change my product to make it healthier, or I can do something of both. And how I frame that opportunity or how I frame that problem can dramatically affect the outcome. So if I frame it as a threat, hey, nobody wants to have soda anymore. Nobody likes high fructose corn syrup. Nobody likes Pepsi or Coke. It's a horrible, horrible thing. We're going to lose billions of dollars. It's a huge threat on us at PepsiCola.com. That's one way to frame a problem. Another way to frame that same problem is, hey, the initial problem is people don't want to drink unhealthy drinks. Well, as Pepsi Cola, we as a company could start saying, hey, let's look at doing something else besides making high fructose corn syrup drinks. Why don't we make bubble water like I don't know what it is, like Sparkletts water, or you know, that sparkling water. Why don't we make sparkling water? Why don't we make Propel flavored water? There's an opportunity here. There's a huge opportunity here for us to grow as a company. There's another analogy where it says, hey, if I have a problem and you know there's a I don't know, a 30% chance that you know 1,000 people are going to die, or there's 2/3 chance that I don't know 600 people will live, even though it's the same math, we tend to change our brain set. We tend to change our mind based on whether or not it's framed as a loss. We're going to lose market value because people don't like soda, or it's a gain. Hey, there's a new business opportunity for us to sell bottled water. So it depends on our brain set or how a problem is framed, depends on how our reaction is to that problem. So we go back to the newspaper and this prospect theory. So the idea was, you know, newspapers and the internet presented a large problem to newspapers. Go back over to my iPad. Okay, so let's say it's, I don't know, early 2000s. I'm not sure the exact date. And I have a newspaper. And there's this new technology out there, PDFs, Craigslist, and whatever else, you know, is on the internet. So now, as a, I don't know, CEO, editor of a newspaper, I can look at the internet. I can look at this in one of two ways. I can look at it let me change the color. As a threat, as a problem, and work and get defensive. B, I can see it as an opportunity. I can create new markets. I can create new products. I can increase something, or I can get a new product out to market. Now, kind of what prospect theory says that really neither one of these is the best idea. That this one and this one, neither one of them work really well. But you kind of have to do both. You have to kind of see certain things as a threat or a problem, so you invest enough capital, you invest enough labor to deal with a problem by addressing new and innovative technologies or by new opportunities. If you do one or the other, it doesn't seem to really solve the problem. And going down the decision-making idea or the decision process, what's really bad? Let's see here, what's purple? What's really bad, okay, is that when a CEO frames something for you and you don't come up with a balanced frame. And what do I mean by this? So if the CEO, your boss, the C-suites and manager says, "Hey, we have these new papers, or sorry, these new internet things coming out, and they're a huge threat to our newspaper ads, or classified ads, our personal ads, and this internet thing is going to just destroy us." If somebody frames it for you and puts that bias in your head, that can be very bad for a business. It can be almost detrimental to a business. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about Kennedy and how this kind of affected Kennedy, for example, President John F. Kennedy. So it's important for middle managers and even upper management to present problems as not necessarily as a threat and not necessarily as an opportunity, but more as a way to collect data and collectively, through discussion, come up with a solution. Again, going back to prospect theory, it talks a lot about loss aversion. People tend to avoid losses to acquiring equivalent gains, even though they're almost the same thing. We're more afraid of losing than we are of gaining. Also, diminishing sensitivity. This is a really big issue too. We as humans don't understand large numbers, and so that, even though that's not part of prospect theory, when we talk about the difference between 1 million and 1 billion, it's the same. Yeah, billions more. I know that. We all know that. But how much different is a billion versus a million? If we had a product that had a $1 billion revenue versus $1 million revenue, but had X, Y, and Z components to make it happen, how much of a difference is that? Can we really encapsulate that in our head? We can't. And so part of prospect theory says, hey, the difference between like $0 and $100 feels more significant, feels more impactful than the difference between $100 and $200. But they're the same. If you say, hey, if you take this bet, you go from $200 to $100, okay, no big deal. Or if I take this bet, I'm gonna go from $100 to $0. Whoa! Even just saying it out loud. Just take a second and say that. Hey, I'm gonna take this bet on this horse or a football team, and I'm gonna go from $1,500 from $1,500 to $1,000. Okay, you're down $500. No big deal. You still have $1,000. I'm gonna take this bet on this horse or this team or whatever people lose money on, and I'm gonna go from $150 down to $0. Ooh, when you hit that 0, you can almost feel it inside. You can almost feel it in your stomach. Just say it, from $150 to $0. $1,500 to $1,000. But that $1,500 to $1,000, that's a lot bigger loss. But yet we can't necessarily rationalize the difference in that. I'm not going to talk about weighing, probability weighing. So now, when we go to reasoning by analogy, and I know this is kind of all over the place, guys. This is just, like I said, my notes. Some of them were handwritten notes, some of them were typed notes. My notes were all over the place over the last kind of couple of years. So, reasoning by analogy, we as humans try to reason and compare from the past, especially more when you step up in leadership more. People tend to say, hey, John did this, Tom did this. If I do that, it's either going to be good or bad. Okay. Research shows that we tend to focus on similarities between two analogous situations, or downplay or ignore the differences. And when I learned about this originally in my notes, we talked about Enron. Okay, so Enron was that big company, 10 years ago, that came up with a unique contract market idea. But now, if we really look at kind of how Enron started or how Enron got there, what do we know? We know that Enron was a natural gas company, not necessarily a power company, okay? But they started trading natural gas contracts. Then they incentivized their employees to kind of take this idea and run with it to other markets. And what happens is that their employees, see if I get a little room here, their employees basically looked only at the similarities between natural gas and, for example, broadband. Yeah, Enron used to sell broadband contracts. And the problem is, well, yeah, there are still contracts. There's a lot of differences between them. A lot of differences between them. And people tend to not look at those. Another example that I have is Staples. So Staples was one of the first mega, I don't know, all-in-one type stores, like PetSmart, like a lot of these stores that have one centralized location and all particular type of market. Okay. So the idea with Staples is that, hey, we can have a single location. We can have managers that are highly efficient. We can have inventory controls. We can optimize a lot of things by putting it all in one location. And when we optimize all these things by putting it in one location, let me switch back over here. Maybe scroll down here, or okay, when we optimize by putting it all in one location, we can save money for the customer, so we can increase profits and the customer's happy, and it just works better. So that was the original idea of Staples. And you know what? For Staples and Office Depot, Office Max, a million other corporations, it works great. Some of the original founders of Staples went out and launched a dry cleaning company called Zoots. And it's funny because my dry cleaner works the same way. When I go to drop off my dry cleaner, I give it to them, and they ship it out to some main location. That main location that does the dry cleaning has operational efficiency, so they can have one big scale of economy. They can have one machine that does all the dry cleaning and drive it back. So they looked at all the similarities between, hey, if we consolidate, office supplies in one location, we get all these things, economy of scale, better growth, better management, better operational efficiency, better leasing terms. I mean, just a million different things. And they tried bringing that to dry cleaning. Hey, if we take all these small dry cleaning businesses and either deliver dry cleaning to one big location, we get scale of economy, we get better management, we get better, we get all these things. The problem is they don't look at the differences. They didn't look at not what was different between Staples and dry cleaning. One of the huge problems, or one of the huge failures of that, was that people that go to dry cleaners often want customization. There's not too often you went out and bought a pen. Here's a pen. And you go to the Office Depot manager or the Staples manager and says, hey, you know what? Can you make this pen green? They're like, no, I have what I have. Here's a notebook. In my notebook, maybe I go to the Office Depot manager and say, hey, you know what? I don't want this notebook to be 8.5 by 11. I want it to be 3 inches by 12 inches. What would the Office Depot manager tell you? Oh, you're crazy. Go pound rocks. They wouldn't accommodate that request because they can't. But now with dry cleaning, it's a completely different game. With dry cleaning, I take my clothes to dry cleaning and I say, hey, I want medium starch. I want heavy starch. Can you fix this button? Oh, can you add a button? And if your dry cleaner told you to go away, we can't do that. We'll just give you this one type of laundry service and nothing else. That dry cleaning business would go out of business very quickly. So while there are similarities between, these mega stores like Staples and PetSmart and local dry cleaning businesses, there's also huge differences. And it's failure to recognize those differences that made a bad decision. So a couple ways to overcome that, since this was so impactful to me, is first write down all the likenesses and the differences between the two analogies. So here's a great example. So this is MIS 776 Business Intelligence. I think the last class, I know the last class I taught was Intro to Telecommunications, which is electrical encoding models, like how does your cell phone take your voice, break it up into discrete digital bits, encode it, encrypt it, send it over a cellular network, get it to another cellular network, transcode it, and send it back to another cellular receiver in a secure manner. That's a lot of what the last class I taught was. So the similarities, let me think, well, they're both taught at colleges. They both have students. They both have smart students. Well, other than that, it kind of dies off there. In that electrical engineering class, I had engineering students. We focused on math a lot more. They didn't like pictures and PowerPoints. They wanted a dry erase marker and let's hit Manchester encoding. Let's talk about signal to noise ratio on different cell towers. Let's talk about different type of trunking techniques. Here, I'm not trying to convince you of this, hey, here's a machine learning model. Here's why we use 12 nodes instead of 8 nodes, or here's ridge regression versus linear regression. You guys can Google that. Hey, Richard, what's the difference between ridge regression and linear regression? Well, ridge regression has a correction for multiple regressions built into it. So, no. You guys Google it. I don't want you to be the engineers and math experts to do that. I want you to know that there is a difference, and when you need to know the difference, you can Google it. In my engineering classes, we need to know the differences. It can make the difference between life and death, maybe. So that's why it's important to overcome this, hey, it's just like this. So we write down the similarities and we write down the differences. Another technique, and I love this technique too, so let me switch over, is to write down the knowns, unknowns, and presumed. So let's work on this for a second. This is so impactful. Okay, so let's look at, MIS versus the EE, versus, we'll just do computer science. Okay, so this will be a class on networks. And this will be a class on business intelligence, BI. Okay, so what's known? Well, known, they're both at a college. They both have students. Now, what's unknown? Well, I don't know the exact amount, the exact percentage of students that actually have jobs and are working right now in full-time work. In my networking classes, it was about 90 to 95%. Most of the people that took my networking classes were networking engineers and network professionals that wanted to know particular theories of, I guess, networking. Okay, some of the things that else weren't known is here we don't do a lot of, I guess, labs, or we don't do a lot of, I guess, I don't want to use the word hands-on, but we don't do a lot of hands-on stuff. Okay, here we do a lot of hands-on stuff. And what do I mean by that? So, like in my networking classes, I would give you a configuration that's broken, and I'd sit right next to you and have you talk me through what you think is wrong and how you think you're going to solve that problem. Okay. Now, the presumptions, I'm just trying to think of some. So is that you both want to, I guess, pass the class? Yeah. I'm assuming that's a presumption for both of them. I'm sure there's other ones, but by writing down this kind of, hey, here's what's known between the two analogies I'm making. Here's what's unknown. And here's what I'm presuming. Here's what I'm assuming. Here's what I think is the case. Okay. Yeah, I cannot stress that enough. These two techniques, because this. Actually, I'm gonna highlight it. And this. What's the same and what's different between two, and what's known, unknown, and presumed in the situation. So basically, all you're doing is looking at situation or analogy A versus B. What's the difference? Now, we talked a little bit about kinetics, but let's talk a little bit more in detail. So, and again, I'm not the greatest history buff, so I just don't know a ton about this. So I'll give you that up front. But from what I do know and what I remember and what I've read about this particular decision-making ability, okay, And we look at that World War Z or whatever the video I showed on YouTube. And this is the important part, is knowing that you've made a mistake maybe and figuring out how to make it better. So basically President Kennedy came into office, and something was like within the first week, first month, there was a big Bay of Pigs coup and problem. It was just a failure. In a nutshell, the American CIA said, hey, let's train these insurgents, or I don't want to use the word terrorists, but basically they're terrorists, to overthrow Fidel Castro. And the CIA said, hey, this is going to work, this is going to be great. And the CIA was overconfident. They had the overconfidency bias. And they pushed their thoughts, they pushed their technique, they pushed their ideas on the Joint Chiefs, they pushed it on the president, they pushed it on everyone and said, hey, this is a great idea, blah, blah, blah. And everyone was afraid to speak up against the CIA. So Kennedy kind of, I guess, approved this Bay of Pigs, and it just went horribly. It failed. So it was very bad. Very bad. He made America look bad. It was before my time. So after that, Kennedy basically called Eisenhower. Okay, Eisenhower was a general during World War II. Now, he wasn't a great military general. And I remember reading and knowing about this in my notes, is that he wasn't thought of as this great strategic military genius. But then why did he lead all the Allied forces? He led all the Allied forces because of the way he made decisions. He could find better military leaders, listen to their decisions, and incorporate that into a strategy. It was good decision making versus good knowledge. You know, we go back to some of the things we talked about in the beginning of this lecture, that, hey, businesses make intelligent decisions. They don't. You know, if we had the best military leaders making the best intelligent military decisions, it'd be great. But that's not the way it is. That's not the way it's ever been. So what made Eisenhower really unique is that he was a great decision maker, and it's his method that made him a great decision maker. So, long story, Kennedy calls Eisenhower and said, hey, man, I need help with this whole Cuban Missile Crisis. What am I going to do? You know, we have these Russians want to build, I guess, nuclear missiles or missiles on Cuba. Hey, Eisenhower, can you help me out? I guess the conversation with Eisenhower, or sorry, between Eisenhower and Kennedy, the conversation didn't focus at all on military, nothing about that. Eisenhower said, hey, what did you ask your advisors? Who's bringing this information to you? How are you getting this information in terms of, you know, are you asking for it? Is somebody pushing the information? So Eisenhower kind of basically gave Kennedy the assistance on how to make a decision. Okay. And from Eisenhower's feedback, Kennedy made much better decisions going forward. Some of the decisions that, for example, Kennedy did is he would no longer be in rooms where they had meetings a lot of times, because Eisenhower and Kennedy both felt that with the president there or the big general, you don't want to sound stupid. I'm sure that you guys don't want to sound stupid in front of me as your professor, but don't worry, it happens all the time. I sound stupid in front of my boss all the time. It's very important to be able to sound stupid, to say dumb things, and feel confident about that. Now, why is that, Richard? Oh my God, that's crazy. I've never heard that before. That's important because what happened with the Bay of Pigs is nobody spoke up. Everyone was afraid to sound, everyone did not want to go against the CIA. The CIA. You don't want to go against the CIA. A lot of people in memos and in writing had a lot of reservations about the Bay of Pigs. But if you have the president of the United States, the CIA there, and you're just some like lonely analyst, you don't want to be like, I think your idea sucks. You just don't want to do that. So one thing that Eisenhower and kind of imparted on Kennedy is that, hey, pull yourself out of those meetings. And then if you have a lonely analyst, it's, maybe you go against just the CIA and say, hey, your idea is kind of dumb, or what about this? Also, another idea is not to go to always the leaders. Go to the people actually working on the data. You know, don't always just, let's see, people would generally be asked, you know, not simply as specialists representing their agency. You know, this is a different aspect of that too. But yeah, he would directly communicate with low-level officers. Okay, so this would be a thing that Eisenhower did to make better decisions. Instead of going from CEO to CEO, or sorry, CEO to COO to, you know, vice president, no. Sometimes Eisenhower would just call lieutenants, lower ranking generals. Hey, what do you think about this? Hey, can I get your feedback on this? And kind of, not necessarily taken by surprise, but just kind of get the people on the ground. You know, I think it was in lesson 4 or 5 when we talked about lean. I stressed the importance of going out to the gemba, to the production floor. You know, and that is what one of the things that Eisenhower talked about. Another thing is that, hey, you don't want just, you know, people would be asked to serve as skeptic generalists, not just simply specialists. So my area of expertise is data, machine learning, and ethics, and business intelligence. But sometimes I'm asked to do things that are outside my comfort zone. I get to sit on committees or hiring committees or things that I may not know a lot about. Now, why would I ever say yes? And why do people ask me to do that? Because sometimes asking dumb questions in those meetings brings up really valid points. And so that's another thing that Eisenhower imparted on Kennedy is, hey, you know, you don't talk to just your specialists. Talk to people outside that domain expertise and ask them for feedback. Hey, what do you think about this? And they may not know anything, and that's okay. But when they don't know anything, they ask questions. And when they ask questions, let's see, do I have it in here somewhere? That gets basically conflict and debate. Okay, and that conflict and debate is so valuable. Now, you don't want debate and conflict just to be negative. We look at American media and all things that are going on right now, and it seems that there's two polar opposites of any topic. And that's not really the way it should be. We should have a debate and conflict in a productive manner. And that's how we make the best decisions possible. That's one of the things I love about UNLV is that diversity. If I go to a campus where everyone thinks like me, am I really going to grow? No. If I'm in a campus where everyone's different from me, then I can understand people's opinions, ideas. And I'm like, oh, you know what? I never thought about that. So that's another thing that Eisenhower kind of imparted on Kennedy, because it's group think. This talks a little bit about going out and seeing observations. Okay, well, you know, we can get the data that we need from, you know, we get the data. Actually, let me go down here. So we get the data. We get manager feedback, let's say. We get all this stuff to understand problem X. Okay? But have we seen it for ourselves? Have we got away from our desk and walked? I don't know how to make little footprints here. And walked and seen the problem. It's a huge thing. So often at Optum, I hate to bring my work to often at Optum, you'll hear some of the senior leaders. You know, these are people with the C's in their name. They're very, very high up at corporate. Talk about the problems they've experienced getting health care. I was in a meeting last week when a doctor, his wife just had a baby 3 months ago. I think it's 3 months ago that they just had their baby. And, you know, so he's a full MD with a bunch of specialization. And you know what his problem is? His wife was not allowed to use the restroom when she was in the hospital. He was not allowed to disconnect any of the leads to monitor them. There's something called a taco that looks at your baby's heartbeat, and it drove him up a wall. He would push the button to get a nurse, and after an hour or two, the doctor got frustrated he's a doctor. I mean, I'm surprised he waited 2 hours, but he did. He said he waited an hour or 2 hours, often pushing the nurse button a couple times, going out and trying to look and find a nurse and not getting the service he wanted. And his wife had to use the restroom, and she can't because she's attached to all these wires. So he and I are working on a method to kind of fix that. There was another CEO, or not CEO, VP of, I guess, product development. I think that's what he was. And he was going to, I guess him and his kids were going to the doctor. And they talked about how they had to give their history, their medical history, to the MA that checked them in, the nurse that took their vitals, the doctor that saw them, and I guess they did some type of x-ray or something else after that. So like 5 people. And he timed it, and it took like 18 minutes to recite that same story to the 4 or 5 different people. But he would have never known about that until he got off. I don't want to say got off his butt, but got away from his desk and gone out to the production floor. So that is why it's so important to. Let's see if I can get the highlighter again. Observing how people interact with their products in a natural environment, rather than relying solely on verbal feedback. Observation is the key. Okay, that will make the difference in your decision making night and day, especially with the larger products. I was going to go a little bit on the impact of emotions. This is from what's the name of his book? Thinking Fast and Slow. But a lot of what it deals with is how our system 1, which is our fast reaction, our instant gut response to something, is a very fast and intuitive thought process, where system 2 is our more analytical, our more thought-based, our more reason-based system. How we can overcome that. The traditional, let's see if I have a little room here. The traditional ideal on that, or that basically comes up with, is we have 2 lines that are same length. One goes like, I guess, like this, and one goes like this. So now we know in our brain that they don't even look the same to me. We know in our brains, in our system 2, that they're same length. But our system 1 is overriding that information, saying, hey, they're different size. So that is the idea that emotional priming, emotional ideas can overtake logical decisions in ways we may not even realize. That is why it's so vital that leaders, or that actual person that has to sign off on the decision, not frame a problem incorrectly. Hey, here's a problem. Here's an opportunity, fear of loss negotiation. No, I'm not going to cover that. So here is another thing too. So this is going more back to traditional data decision making. Okay. So do I have? So here's some references I'll give you guys if you want. Actually, right there are my notes. So we had a paper, okay? And let me take a step back. So a person goes to a hospital. They get discharged. Now the job of home health is, I don't want to use that color because that will give you a negative emotion. The job of home health is to make sure that they don't readmit. That is one of the main jobs, that's one of the main scopes of home health. And it makes sense. You leave a hospital with a broken leg, and you have 2 choices. You can go home and sit on the couch and watch MASH or whatever TV shows are out there, Game of Thrones, or you can go to home health. Home health will send a nurse out and says, hey, you have to go out and walk. You have to go out and take your medications. You have to do these things to prevent yourself from going back to the hospital. So that's one of the sole goals. That's one of the sole business impacts of home health. So let me go back to our paper. So our paper, basically, we looked at this. We looked at people that were discharged from the hospital and that basically got no home health, no home care, no home health, versus those who got home health. Okay, very simple comparison. People that didn't get home health versus those that did get home health. What do you think we found? Or let me rephrase, what do you think so many people got mad at us about? These people had a higher readmission rate. I need an A in there, readmission, ISON, readmission rate. And oh my God, that was horrible. That, when it was me and him were first working on this, we saw this, we thought the data was wrong. So we spent another literally 3 months going over the data, checking everything, verifying everything, looking for confounding variables. We couldn't overcome our bias and our idea that was true. And then I thought about it, and I was able to figure it out very simply. One thing that we did notice, that these people died at a higher rate than these. So now let's think about this. Let me go back to the video here. Where are we at here? Okay, right here. So if we have 1,000 people that get discharged from the hospital, or even better, we have 100 people that get discharged from a hospital, and 100 people that never gone to the hospital. They've never seen a doctor. The people who have never seen a doctor are going to have a much lower readmission rate. Why? Because they've never seen a doctor. And they're also going to die a lot younger too. If you never see a doctor your whole life, you will die a lot younger. And if you do see a doctor and the doctor says something's wrong, who's going to send you back to the hospital? Hence higher readmission rate. Not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't mean that home health is not doing their job. It means quite the opposite. Okay. So we go down here. Okay, so let me switch over to the iPad again. So actually, let me add 1,000. Okay, so these people right here that got no care, no post-discharge care, versus these that got yes care. These people basically refused any additional medical services. Since they refused medical service, their readmission rate was lower. Their utilization rate, how much money the people spent on them, the insurance spent on them, was lower. But guess what? They die statistically at a much higher rate and much sooner. Why? Because 1,000 people here versus 1,000 people here, none of these people go back. You got a 0%. And only one, even just one person goes back to the hospital, and 9,999 do not. You're going to have a higher readmission rate here. That doesn't mean that home health is not doing their job. It just means that we're looking at the wrong metric. We shouldn't be comparing these two populations. Okay? And this was a very controversial, very problematic research that we did. So we did the data collection. We collected all that data. Hey, here's 1,000. It was, I don't even know, 17,000 discharges. I forget the exact number. But here's 17,000 discharges over 3 years. And we broke them down. Hey, these people got a medical order to go to home health, and they never followed up on it. And these people did follow up on it. So we got all the data. We got everything else. Then we started analyzing it. And as soon as we started analyzing, and it's not a mathematically hard analysis. So, I mean, you have, 100 people, and how many of them went back to the hospital within 30 days? So 50 out of 100 went back to hospital, 50% readmission rate. It's simple division. A 5-year-old can do it. So we're not talking a huge amount of data analytics on this. There's some cleaning and some other things, but basically you got it. Now, the problem is once we analyze this data, we realized something was wrong. At least we thought something was wrong. We couldn't trust in the data. We were overconfident in our bias. We had the overconfidency bias that home health reduced readmission rates. That's what we were told for the last 20 years. We give people doctors and they get a lower readmission rate. I mean, it's common sense. Think about it like this. Do people with coaches, are they better athletes than people that don't have coaches? Well, people that aren't, people that don't have coaches aren't necessarily athletes. You can't really compare the two. So once the data analysis kind of failed, or not failed, we went back up here and collected more data. And then once after a second or third time, we realized that, hey, it wasn't our data. We may have to make a decision that our data showed X, Y, and Z. And that home health leads to a higher readmission rate. Exact opposite of everything that every journal, every home health agency in the world has been taught. But home health also reduces mortality. And so now we're working on another paper related to this. So this is kind of how the data or the decision-making process, I guess, should kind of work in a perfect world, except for, trying to overcome your cognitive bias. So here's some references. What else do I have in here? I have additional books I'm going to give you next week. Yeah, that's all of them. Remember, decision making is a hard process. And I know that sounds dumb, but let me switch this over to this. We are taught return on investment. We are taught how to calculate all these different matrices. We learn how to pull data in this class. We learn how to do EDA. We learn how to do basic machine learning. We learn how to create reports. But has anybody ever taught you how to kind of make a decision on that? How to include culture, how to include diversity, how to include conversation? I mean, if somebody tells you, if I tell you, not me, but if somebody tells you, hey, I think this is wrong because of X, Y, and Z, do you get mad and fight against me? Do you take my feedback and make a good cognitive approach? Do you change your ideas? We're not often taught good decision making. Not necessarily strategic decision making, but just short-term or business decision making. And one of the ways that we need to overcome decision making or this lack of understanding decision making is just to kind of, I guess, teach decision making more, teach ideas, learn from past mistakes. This is what Kennedy did. This is how he overcame it. This is what people that climbed to Mount Everest did. Here's their mistakes. Here's how they fixed it. And just remember too, another thing too, just because you make the right decisions doesn't mean that people are going to love you either. We look at Ford and Lee Iacocca and the Mustang and minivan, they fired him. And he made that company so much money because he made right decisions, but the people above him didn't like his decisions because they had their biases. Sports players, in a lot of teams, there's a lot of research into who should go on a field, who shouldn't go on a field. What data is there to support this? So there's a lot of information on decision making, a lot of scattered information on decision making. Some of it is very focused, some of it is very very, I guess, domain specific. Hold on one second, let me see if I can find some things here. So I want to go to my library really quick, my bookcase, and grab some books. So here's one book, and here is another book. Okay, both these books talk about how to use data to kind of change and make business decisions. Now, this business science, this data science for business book here, I think what I remember highlighting some stuff here, talks more about, let me see if I can pull it up here, what they call analytical engineering, analytical management, okay, which again goes to the idea that, hey, businesses make intelligent decisions, and we know that's not the case. Data Smart, another great book, talks about incorporating, one of the things she talks about is incorporating culture into making decisions in data, making more business intelligence decisions. So instead of having these really complex, I don't want to use the word complex, instead of having these hard to understand decisions, let's make things a lot simpler. And if we make things simpler and more direct without really lying about the scope of them, then we can drive change in the business. What else do I have? This is another one, is a great book too, The Future of Drug Discovery. This book talks about how companies kind of decide what drugs move forward, what drugs don't move forward, and the kind of thought process behind it, you know, and the iterative process, just how we, you know, when we're talking about that paper, how we had to revise the data, how do we revise the data? And that was just a waste of time. We were overconfident that we were doing something right when we weren't. Let me rephrase that question, that's not right. We were confident that home health would reduce readmission rate, but that's not the case. It increased readmission rate because as a doctor or a nurse, if you see somebody sick, you want to get them better. And if that requires them to go to the hospital, you send them to the hospital. If a person just refuses any medical care and just never goes to the hospital, they're going to have a lower readmission rate because at the end of the day, they're going to be dead. And so that book kind of covers things like this. And so, I mean, there's always a lot of different ideas on decision making. And I guess the point I'm just trying to express is that while we read a lot on nerd stuff, either Python or Lean or machine learning, for every 2, 3, 4, 5 books you read or articles you read on Medium about a technique or process, do yourself a big favor and read one on judgment, read one on strategic decision making, read one on management errors or clerical errors. You know, there is an article I read last week that talks about without adding redundancies. When you add redundancies to a system, it becomes more complex. The more complex a system is, the more likely it is to fail, which is almost an oxymoron. So you have these nuclear power plants, and you don't want them to fail. So what do? You add a backup system. Well, that backup system just adds a whole bunch of complexity. Well, then you add a backup system on the backup system, and then you add some type of system that says, hey, here's A, B, and C. If this doesn't work to do that, now it's just so complex, it's almost guaranteed to fail. And the analogy of this is cars and digital technology. Well, we don't want to be driving, and we don't want the software on our Tesla or our digital EV car to fail. So we add a backup system. And on top of the backup system, we add another backup system. And then we add cameras, and it becomes so complex, it's inevitable that it will fail eventually. So for every couple articles, books, hours, days you spend learning about a technical skill or statistics, please, I implore you to read at least one article on ethics, privacy, and people's rights. and to read an article or two on how to become a better leader, how to make better decisions. How, what is philosophy? What did Socrates think about X, Y, and Z? What did Plato think? How did Kennedy learn from Eisenhower? What caused Napoleon to fail versus what caused Napoleon to succeed? What caused Lee Iacocca to succeed or fail? And there's tons of documented paperwork on all these examples and thousands more. And when you read those articles, just take back and remember that, is it written by a psychiatrist? Is it written by a sociologist? Is it written by an MBA, a business major? Is it written by an economist? Sorry about that. And just keep that in the back of your mind. And eventually you'll learn to start making better decisions. And once you start making better decisions, managers and other people will trust you more, hopefully. And then you'll be able to grow naturally. Don't worry about climbing the corporate ladder. Worry about making the best decisions possible. I hope you all have a great week. Again, next week we'll cover some emerging technologies and some miscellaneous other products. But please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you and have a great week.